John Bolton is a former Trump's national security advisor and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome to our program, Ambassador Bolton.
Glad to be with you.
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump said that ending the war in Ukraine would be his #1 foreign policy priority. Also, Trump's team will try to organize a ceasefire in Ukraine. What can happen if Vladimir Putin declines Trump's offer on Ukraine?
Well, Trump has threatened that there would be serious consequences for Russia if they didn't engage. And that may well be the case. But I think the greater likelihood is that Putin will graciously follow Trump's request and agree to a ceasefire and the commencement of negotiations. Because I think from the Russian perspective, if they can freeze a ceasefire along the actual line of control inside Ukraine, their hope is that as negotiations in Geneva or wherever they turn out to be drag on, that separation along the line of control becomes a new border between Russia and Ukraine, which would obviously be a terrible setback for the Ukrainians.
Also, there are some discussions that in case of a ceasefire in Ukraine, Ukrainian armed forces could, or Ukrainian government can regain control of those occupied territories after the Putin's departure in the future. What is your take on that?
Well, I wouldn't count on that coming. I mean, look, the Russian government today is not a government as we understand it. It's one-man rule. There are no checks and balances, no competing structures. We don't know what the Russian government will look like when Putin passes from the scene, and we don't know how long it will be until that happens. So I'm very afraid that things like what Vice President-elect J.D. Vance suggested in the campaign, that you'd set up a demilitarized zone along the ceasefire line, a kind of partition that's been compared to North and South Korea, is not a model that Ukraine wants to follow. The armistice in Korea began in 1953 and is still going on. So, almost 75 years later, the two Koreas remain divided. That's not something that I think is in Ukraine's interest.
But you are confident that Vladimir Putin will agree with Trump's proposal and would like to have a ceasefire in Ukraine, for example, next year?
Yes, I think it is in his interest. I think it's a way for him out of a situation that's becoming increasingly difficult. The Ukrainian response to the Russian invasion resulted in a significant military defeat for Russian combat arms. Casualties are extraordinarily high. They've lost enormous amounts of equipment. The Black Sea Fleet has been substantially damaged. The sanctions that were imposed after the invasion in 2022, while very far from effective, have nonetheless caused economic harm to Russia. I think Putin would like a breathing spell, a chance to recover, but he doesn't want to do it in a way that makes him look weak or makes it look like he's being forced into it. The intervention of his good friend, Donald Trump, gives him a hook on which to base the agreement to enter into negotiations and the ceasefire. He may miss the opportunity, but it would be in his interest to accept it.
President Zelensky says that Vladimir Putin fears only Donald Trump and China. Is he right? And can you imagine a scenario in which Trump goes into confrontation with Vladimir Putin?
Well, anything is possible with Trump since he doesn't have a national security philosophy. He sees things through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. I don't think Putin fears Trump. I think it's actually much worse than that. I think he believes he can manipulate Trump, that he knows how to flatter him, he knows his weaknesses, and that he can play him in ways that other leaders, including President Zelensky, can't. And I don't think he fears China as much as we might like him to fear China. He needs China, and he knows it. He doesn't like it, but he's got plenty of allies, unfortunately, in this fight. It's not as we've imagined it for the last several years. Ukraine supported by NATO against Russia alone. It's Russia, supported by China, supported by Iran, supported by North Korea. It's a much deeper opponent on the other side than I think many people understand.
According to the latest Trump's interview with Times, Donald Trump does not support U.S. authorization for Ukraine to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with American-made weapons. But how can Donald Trump really get Vladimir Putin to negotiations table without putting pressure on him and without allowing Ukraine to destroy Russian targets inside Russia?
Well, I think we should have granted authorization for that kind of use of the weapons about 3 years ago. I mean, this is part of the reason the non-strategic way the assistance was delivered, parceled out after long internal debates, that's made it difficult, if not impossible, for Ukraine to respond really in a strategic way to the Russian military incursion. So, Trump doesn't think these things through. He tosses off ideas which he may or may not actually believe in or remember the next week. So I think that the limitation on the use of American arms may be a temporary issue, but it's a political question. How best for Ukraine to avoid being taken advantage of by the Russians in negotiations. And we see Chancellor Scholz of Germany speaking with Putin. We see Viktor Orban of Hungary about to speak with Putin. Others may as well. And I'm very worried that as the European Union members see the apparent weakening of American resolve, that their resolve is weakening too. So it's a very dangerous point for Ukraine here, and one that unfortunately I think Putin will try and take full advantage of.
Also, according to the Polish newspaper Rzeczpospolita, French President Emmanuel Macron is trying to coordinate, to organize a European coalition which can put boots on the ground in Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire deal between Ukraine and Russia. What is your take on that? And would it be in Ukraine? Would such scenario be in Ukraine's favor if European troops are deployed to Ukraine to enforce such a ceasefire, demilitarized zone?
Look, I think it's very dangerous for Ukraine to agree to anything like a substantial demilitarized zone. And it doesn't matter whether it's UN peacekeepers or NATO peacekeepers. Once you put troops on the ground, you are hardening that ceasefire line and making it more difficult to achieve at some point diplomatically what all NATO members say is their objective in aiding Ukraine, which is the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. And by the way, what I at least haven't heard suggestions like J.D. Vance's or Emmanuel Macron's cover, is this demilitarized zone going to be along the battlefield inside Ukraine today only, or will there be a demilitarized zone on the existing Ukraine-Russian border to the north of the Donbass region? Are you really going to put peacekeepers all along that entire border? And by the way, will they extend to the Ukraine border with Belarus as well? It shows a reflection that many of these suggestions come from people who really don't understand the geography that Ukraine faces.
If you were Trump's national security advisor right now, it's a possible scenario. For example, what would you advise Trump on Ukraine, on the situation in Ukraine? Would you advise to move forward with ceasefire talks, or just to continue to support Ukraine until its victory on the ground?
Well, I certainly wouldn't favor ceasefire talks at this point. I'd get a rationalization of NATO assistance to Ukraine. I'd come up with a plan to use that assistance strategically to drive Russian forces back. And I wouldn't negotiate until we were in more of a position of strength. Look, this has been a grinding war for both Ukraine and Russia. But in any war of attrition, the big country typically, unfortunately, ends up winning. And that's Putin knows that. And he's counting on short attention spans in Europe and in the United States, particularly Donald Trump's short attention span. So I wouldn't at this point begin negotiations, but I'd get our military assistance program better aligned than it was for the last 3 years. and see if it can make a difference. The time to negotiate is when Ukraine's moving forward, not moving backward.